So there is a worrisome trend that I have noticed among mental health influencers, and that is a trend of moralizing pathology. What do I mean by moralizing pathology? Well, let's take a quick example look. Here we have Dr. Ramani, who has sort of made it her career to fight against narcissistic abuse. Now, there is nothing necessarily wrong with that. However, the fact that Dr. Ramani has kind of become a sort of a celebrity and one of the on-call experts to diagnose and identify narcissistic abuse, even in people that they're not treating, is problematic in and of itself. There is a very, very thin line between essentially being an advocate for mental health, making sure that people are aware of certain things, causes, diagnoses, etc., because that helps fight stigma. But the moment that a practitioner or even an advocate starts crossing the line into celebrity status, that is where a whole lot of very big ethical issues begin to appear. And Dr. Ramani has started showing signs of that. There is something strange that happens to people and celebrity, and it seems that very few people are indeed equipped to handle it without it going to their heads. That reminds me of how the Stoics would think about sorts of things like this. Stoics believe that you don't rise to the occasion all of a sudden, but instead that you fall back on your training. That is why Stoics practice such things as premeditatio malorum, which is the premeditation of incoming ills, and that sounds worse than it actually is. But they also put themselves in separate and very different situations and meditate upon what they would do in those cases. So in the case of premeditatio malorum is essentially when you consider what things might happen, what things could go wrong, stemming from one choice or another. And you fully contemplate all of the possibilities that you can think of things going wrong. And at each juncture, you posit, well, what can I do if this happens? What will I do if this happens? What is the worst thing that can happen here? So that in a way, if things do go wrong, that you sort of prepare yourself for that. And that is a very, very useful thing, because it's not about being morose and contemplating the worst of all possible worlds, but in fact, it is preparing yourself psychologically so that you can deal with an emergency if it happens. Unfortunately, most people do not practice its opposite practice. Premeditatio bonorum is where you imagine the opposite. What can you do if things go right? If things go okay, if things go great, if things go the best possible way? Because, and this is important, all of the narratives where people say that power corrupts you and money corrupts you, the Stoics didn't believe that that was the case. The Stoics simply believed that the occasion revealed the person, that the opportunity revealed the person. And what was revealed oftentimes in cases where someone acquires a lot of power and becomes corrupt is that that person had never done any internal work to sort of lay an ethical and moral groundwork around the potential of what will I do if I suddenly get an insane amount of power over people. And that is why, according to many of the Stoics, that is why people who suddenly come into great opportunities often screw the pooch so badly, because they haven't really deliberately thought about what they will do should they receive a windfall or a great stroke of luck. And it's important to point out that the question is not about engaging in wistful thinking and wishful thinking, such as, I will, if I get all the money in the world, I will buy Disneyland. No, it's about how will I act ethically if I am given this opportunity. Suddenly the power is there, but it doesn't catch you unawares to the point that you start making terrible, terrible choices. It's important to point out that premeditatio bonorum does not exist in the canonical writings of the Stoics. Neither Musonius Rufus, nor Epictetus, nor Marcus Aurelius talk about them. They really did focus a lot on premeditatio malorum because, it was the ancient world and catastrophes tended to abound even more so than today, although perhaps we're getting there. but I do believe in having balanced practices because, yes, I think it is very important that you're able to prepare yourself for emergencies so that you are no longer emotionally invested in the emergency when it happens. You have trained yourself for it so you know what to do. Actually, I sort of prepared myself this way without really knowing about it because, you see, I grew up in a country that was right on the end of St. Andrew's Fault. So anytime St. Andrew's Fault would shake, we shook like jello. And I just happened to have a mother who had a mortal fear of earthquakes. I know, right? And we're talking to the point that the ground started trembling and she would scream, "Earthquake! Earthquake!" And she would run. She would run to the front door, no matter what state of dress she was in, no matter what she was doing. She would run to the front door. And at times even potentially run out into the street. Now, as you know, it is very, very dangerous to do that, to run out into the street for many reasons. Traffic can be diverted during a quake so that she could potentially be run over. But also if the quake is strong enough for fissures to open, for example. So, as a kid, I was kind of afraid of my mother going out into the street and something happening to her. So I started imagining myself, well, I am not scared of earthquakes. I mean, I get worried by them, but I don't have that same fear that my mother has. So I thought to myself, well, I would imagine what would happen the next time an earthquake would happen. What would I do? What could I do to make sure everybody stayed safe? And so I would imagine this plan of action. For example, I would imagine if I was playing in my bedroom and I started feeling the ground shake, I knew then I could just get up, run across the hall or walk across the hall, depending on how strong the quake was, and wait for my mother at the door, where I would hug her and we would stay under the door frame. Likewise, I would start imagining what I would do if I were in different parts of the house. And I would sort of walk myself through that in my mind. And then I would start thinking, well, what if we're out of doors? What if we're at a mall? And then that eventually became a process of abstraction, just search for the nearest frame, avoid wide open spaces, etc., that sort of thing. But so that it came to happen that the next time that there was a quake, I found myself falling back on a lot of those things that I would imagine. So I would immediately head for the door. I would make sure that everything was ready for the door frame. My mother would come, my grandmother would come. We would huddle in the door frame until the quake passed. And, my mother would, seeing me there, something reined her back in, and she would not follow that impulse to run out into the street, for example. So that is a very important skill to have, the premeditatio malorum. But I think that perhaps one of the flaws of the Stoics, which kind of shows in how, for example, certain Stoic philosopher ended up serving Nero when he really shouldn't have, is the lack of premeditation of what happens when we get a good windfall. And I think this is happening with a lot of these mental health influencers, especially those who should know better, like Dr. Romani, because now she does have a level of celebrity, and that with it comes a greater amount of visibility, but also a greater amount of responsibility. And on April 13th, she made this video that left me very, very concerned for the reasons I will explain soon. First of all, it's from April 13th, and the title is "What is Reverse Gaslighting?" And, well, to begin with, that is a nonsensical notion, because gaslighting is other people trying to alter your perception of reality and your sanity by casting doubt on things that you remember, right? So what could potentially be reverse gaslighting, but for other people trying to reinforce your sanity by agreeing with things that you remember? See, the term does not work, but Dr. Romani, well, let me tell you what happens in the video. You can go see it by yourselves to make sure that I'm telling you something that is right about this video. But in this video, Dr. Romani has had a negative experience with one of her colleagues, and she uses this particular experience to coin a new term, in this case, reverse gaslighting, which follows a trend that has been happening with her where she frequently uses her own personal grievances and frames them as textbook examples of narcissistic abuse. The first ethical line that Dr. Romani crosses in this video is that she is using a real-life example of her colleagues as a point of not only diagnosis, but also kind of moralization. And this is incredibly problematic because, again, Dr. Romani is a very visible practitioner, and it is not very difficult, if you're knowledgeable about her environment, to guess who she's talking about if you are familiar with her professional environment. So that's the first ethical violation, because honestly, mental health practitioners should never be doing this. Mental health practitioners need to be talking about abstract cases and examples. And if you use an example, it needs to be anonymized enough so that nobody actually knows who you're talking about. Dr. Romani and many mental health influencers, both licensed and unlicensed, do this. They sort of create a place where they can air their grievances while also using the language of diagnostics and therapy to cast further aspersions on the individuals that they refer to, which is a huge problem. Now, this is one of the problems that we run into. In this episode, Dr. Romani is discussing a conflict where she receives a long text message from a colleague who omitted key facts and painted a distorted narrative, according to her, of her as disloyal, obtuse, and not being a team player. While in the same message, the person also pivots abruptly to shower her with praise, calling her brilliant, essential, and claiming that everyone thinks that she is amazing. Dr. Romani identifies this as a manipulative tactic that combines traditional gaslighting with contradictory adoration, which creates a destabilizing sense and a cognitive dissonance. Now, this is something that is kind of problematic, and I'll tell you why. Because Dr. Romani actually doesn't provide you any details except her account of the situation. So we don't know what details are missing according to her. We don't know what details are distorted according to her. There is no evidence being provided. And you might say, yes, of course it has to be because it needs to be anonymized. Well, here's the issue though. Dr. Romani talks about how respected this other colleague is in the field. There are many different indications throughout the video when she refers to this individual that are not actually anonymized enough. To give you an idea of the point that I'm making, in this episode, she describes the nature of the professional relationship, and she notes that the individual has a good reputation in the world at large. They hold a position of power and is part of a group involved in a project that is meant to help survivors of abuse. Now, if you know anything about Dr. Romani and you have any proximity to her whatsoever, you're going to know who she's talking about. And even if you're just in the same professional environment, for example, because again, a lot of these individuals, a lot of these professionals who are actively working on projects like this know who is working on what project and in what team. So you have to ask the question, why did Dr. Romani choose to frame this entire situation in this manner instead of simply starting with a theoretical framework, such as, recently, I have come to ponder something that for this moment I am calling reverse gaslighting, which involves a mixture of gaslighting while also having excessive praise as a means to destabilize the individual. Now, here's the thing. And this is one of the worrisome things. Dr. Romani is actually just, if she is describing the events faithfully, and I have my doubts for the reasons I will explain soon, she's simply combining gaslighting and love bombing, which are both manipulative techniques. This is not a new thing called reverse gaslighting. You can often find gaslighting and love bombing in the same person and often in the same situation, because the gaslighting comes in to undermine a sense of reality and the love bombing comes in to reinforce the confidence in the person, uh, even while the person's own sense of reality is being eroded. But here is a really big problem here. And the red flags in this video about Dr. Romani is that there is a standard expectation that therapists maintain professional boundaries, especially regarding client confidentiality and the avoidance of using personal grievances for public content. In the past, Dr. Romani has often framed her experiences within the context of educational contents, such as using her own life as a case study to illustrate psychological concepts like gaslighting or narcissistic abuse. At this moment, Dr. Romani has now entered the same sphere that many other mental health, both professionals and just influencers, have entered, which is when they use their own platform to discuss specific workplace conflicts. That is blurring the line between professional expertise and professional venting and the airing of grievances. And even when names are withheld, the context is specific enough that it can potentially impact the reputation of the people involved, which is considered a professional overstep. And especially giving her reach. Dr. Romani has a massive platform. And to use it to describe a conflict where the other party may not have an equal opportunity to respond or explain their perspective, that creates a massive power imbalance and asymmetry. So at this moment, Dr. Romani has now crossed the line between being an advocate to being a celebrity who is using her image as an advocate to start airing her grievances and venting and potentially target individuals with whom she has issues, framing them within the language of therapy. And that is incredibly dangerous. In fact, it is kind of indicative of the current mood in social media and such endeavors and such environs, where you find people diagnosing people all over the place and without having any licenses or having any degrees in mental health or similar practices. Dr. Romani, unfortunately, along with many mental health influencers, is directly responsible for shaping the language and culture around this type of practice. And as of the April 13th video, she has now sort of become trapped by the Frankenstein monster that she helped build. Instead of becoming an advocate against narcissistic abuse, and instead of providing good tools for people to care for their own mental health and make sure that they're safe and know how to spot manipulation, she has now become part of the market that caters to dark psychology. And by dark psychology, I mean, you've seen the books. How to defend yourself against narcissists, how to kill a narcissist, all of that stuff, which is honestly just sensationalized and moralized. And this is the point where I go back to what I started with the beginning of this thread. Because you see, look at Dr. Romani using her workplace experience and this particular individual. And you have to ask yourself, well, she didn't anonymize enough. She didn't really care to do that. So why did she do that? Well, one disquieting possibility, and it is really the most likely possibility, is because she is using what she considers to be pathology to also cast a moral aspersion on the person involved. And you also find this all over the place. You're going to see mental health influencers. Most of them have no preparation and have no education. They will start using phrases like good people, bad people, good crazy, bad crazy, when referring to mental health, mental disability, chronic conditions, chronic pathologies. And soon it becomes defend yourself against the evil narcissists, how to decouple from evil borderline personality disorders, how can you walk away from your evil bipolar girlfriend. You see where that leads. Dr. Romani has started taking the baby steps that end in that sort of dialogue. And the more she feels free to use her platform to highlight individuals with whom she has a grievance and lather them with the language of diagnostics and psychology and therapy, the more harm she's going to cause. And unfortunately, this is a template. There are many Dr. Romanis out there. There are many people following this same trend all over the place in social media. People who pretend to be mental health experts or who want to work in the mental health sphere without actually having any licenses or necessary training. They do far more harm than good. Especially, and you'll notice this right away, if they start using those moralizing words instead of simply describing pathology, describing behavior, and describing ways in which behavior can be improved. No mental health expert out there, not a one who is worth their salt, will use moralizing language to refer to a pathology. Not a one. So the moment you start hearing a mental health influencer using the words of moral judgment when referring to a mental illness, you need to turn 180 and run as far as possible. Another thing to watch out for is that these people tend to attract a cult-like following. If you go into the videos for Dr. Romani and you flip through the comments, you're going to start getting a very, very culty vibe. That's not the kind of thing that a serious psychologist or professional would attract. And that is how you start realizing that this person has moved away from the therapeutic and professional sphere and going into the celebrity slash potential cult leader sphere. And that is a red flag. And this is where the premeditatio bonorum comes in, because once again, if someone prepares themselves mentally for the potential of having a large audience and a great deal of attention, then they can guard themselves against it. For example, I don't anticipate I will ever have a large audience. I am actually not particularly fond of seeking attention. I have a tendency to kind of lose myself in my projects and emerge every now and again after I've composed something. But I'm kind of terrible at self-promotion, as some of you might be realizing. I'm not actually interested in attention. So the notion... So the idea that I might have a large audience someday isn't really realistic for me, but still, I have practiced that thought of what would be ethical to do, what can't do from the point of view of ethics, should I ever have a large enough platform that I would have thousands of people listening to me. And I think that's something everyone should do. No matter how unlikely it is, because then you're prepared for it. I don't think Dr. Romani was prepared for it, and she is veering into very dangerous territory. One of the reasons why moralizing pathology is a very deep issue is because it dips into the same kind of territory that original sin thinking dips into. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So the notion of original sin, which is one of the key tenets of a particular set of religions, is that we are all born sinful, flawed, and irredeemable, except under certain conditions. Right? So no matter who you are, no matter what you are, under original sin theory, you were born with original sin. That is something you carry and you can never get rid of it, except through the intervention of someone else. Particular person, be it a savior figure, a particular ritual, or whatever. We're not going to go into the specifics because they're not that important. It's the idea that's important. So, the way that moralized pathology works is pretty much the same thing. For example, if someone has let's say, a cluster B diagnosis or is, for example, bipolar, the dialogue in the current culture already has a stigma against that person. That person is going to be manipulative and evil and scheming or whatever, right? But that doesn't actually tell you anything about the person's behavior. It doesn't tell you anything about the pathology. It doesn't tell you how they're going to handle the pathology or how they're handling it. There is already an assumption that because this person has this diagnosis, let's say this person has histrionic personality disorder, then they're going to do everything for attention. They're not going to check their behavior, and they're going to manipulate me into giving them more attention. That is stigma. That is, as I've mentioned before, that is the ruined identity concept. The ruined identity concept is actually pointing towards the secularized version of original sin. So, the moment that every one of these influencers and these mental health practitioners who have leaned too hard into their celebrity start doing this, they're casting original sin onto a pathology. It is that same thought, that same style of thought. And what does that... So, does that help anything? Well, it doesn't. Because, first of all, it creates a barrier for any person with certain pathologies to ever be taken at face value. They essentially become the interpreted tool of someone else, Dr. Ramani or any other mental health influencers. They will tell you what this person really means, even if they've never met them in their entire life, even if they're not a patient or a client. So that's a problem right there, because this takes autonomy away from the other person. They're not even able to express their own words and say what their actual thoughts are. Then there's usually this classification of redeemable and irredeemable. That gets created the moment the mental health celebrity starts laying out what is acceptable for a person to do and not to do within these cases. Now, there's a difference here between a serious mental health practitioner who delves in general advice, in this case, and someone who has crossed the line into being a grievance YouTuber or influencer, where they use specific examples, even though lightly anonymized, to drive their point. Because then it's very easy to see that the examples that these people use tend to be the unacceptable people. They start becoming the moral examples that you need to avoid, or that you need to correct, or that you need to do whatever to. And very soon, they start giving you guidelines on how you can be one of the good ones, as opposed to the other ones. And little by little, because there is ego at work here, you're going to find that a lot of the tenets to become one of the good ones are tied into many of their personal interactions and grievances, many of the things that set these people off, many of the things that they find unacceptable. And so we have moved from talking about pathology and talking about mental health conditions as an actual educational outlet. And now we have moved into wielding therapy and therapy speak and concepts as weapons to bring people in line with what you want them to do. And that is essentially the bad ending, the dark ending of this particular path. And unfortunately, it is a very common path. It is the most likely path, the path of least resistance. And it is because even someone like Dr. Ramani, who has the training to know better, is starting to fall into it. It has its own gravitational pull. One example of a practitioner who still adheres to a lot of the ethical rules is Dr. Darren McGee, who so far has not delved into using real-life examples without properly anonymizing them enough to the point that they are essentially composites and very, very, very vague abstractions. So far, he has done quite well in this end. And you can see a lot of his replies are very distinct from Dr. Ramani's in his comment section. There's a lot less cultish vibe to them. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that he's immune, and no one should ever think that they are immune from the effects of celebrity and attention. You should always be working on keeping yourself in check. Far too many people do not. But here we have two stark contrasts, Dr. Ramani and Dr. McGee. Dr. McGee speaks very strictly on behavior without using his therapy speak language to point to real world examples of people he has disagreements with in order to actually moralize on them. Because at that moment, that is when you start inviting the moral judgment on individuals, and that is an abuse of your platform, especially if you are painting yourself as a mental health advocate. Your personal grievances and your grievances with colleagues should not start creeping into your work as a mental health advocate, because otherwise that is where you fail. You have essentially failed in being a mental health advocate, and you are now just using your popularity and your audience to hurt people that you don't agree with or who may have fought with you. And that falls into something that is becoming very, very common among these mental health advocates and celebrity mental health professionals, where they are essentially pathologizing normal behavior. By broadcasting highly specific anecdotes about everyday relationship struggles, people like Dr. Ramani encourages a very broad populist view that causes viewers to pathologize normal human flaws, everyday toxicity, or basic incompatibility as signs of narcissistic personality disorder. And the practical result of all of this is that at the very end, there is a lot more stigma floating around than when the advocate and advocates starting doing their work in this particular vein. So how does that help anyone? It doesn't. And I have to pause at something else too. When you couch things in good and bad, and good crazy, bad crazy, good person, bad person, in those very childish terms that have no place in a mental health advocate's vocabulary, you're casting, as I said, original sin and that type of mentality into the mixture. And what you're going to cause is essentially people who have been told that they are bad and evil and all sorts of things because they're mentally ill to start going, well, if I'm really bad, everybody tells me I'm bad. Why should I bother? Why should I do anything? And that is not conducive to mental health. So Dr. Ramani and all of these influencers are essentially, in the long term, in my view, causing harm. And again, I am not a licensed practitioner. I did complete 4 years of psychology before I switched over to opera, but I would not presume myself to be qualified enough to diagnose anyone to begin with. And I'm sharing my point of view from the philosophical perspective and the visible impacts that this has on people and our current culture. And if you think I'm exaggerating, go through online places like Reddit or Blue Sky or Twitter and see how fast people start pathologizing other people's conditions the moment that they start getting into arguments. You'll first see the word unhinged come around, but my God, very soon you'll start seeing narcissists flying around as well, and many other things too. I saw an argument where someone essentially started psychologizing and attributing motives and reasons for why someone brought up one particular example or another, such as, they brought up their disability because they are resentful, because he had to depend on his parents, and that therefore makes... And the original poster never mentioned parents or being dependent on their parents. So it was very, very bizarre, but this is what therapy speak and all of these mental health influencers are causing. They're essentially giving people the impression that because they read a few self-help books and listen to Dr. Ramani, that they know how to diagnose people, when the ability to diagnose someone is something that comes at a great amount of practice and knowledge and training. And even then, you shouldn't do it with people who are not consenting to be diagnosed. Maybe there is something to this particular perspective, and maybe we should start holding a lot of these people accountable to a much rigorous standard, one that is allegedly the one that they should be already holding themselves to. In any case, I hope you have a good day and see you soon.